You're standing in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, surrounded by glittering chandeliers and golden frames that reflect infinite images of opulence and power. The year is 1715, and you're watching the most powerful monarch in Europe hold court. King Louis XIV, the Sun. King himself moves with practiced grace through the assembled nobility, his every gesture commanding absolute reverence. But as he draws closer, something makes your blood run cold. Beneath the layers of powder and rouge, beneath the elaborate wig and silk stockings, you glimpse something the royal propaganda machine desperately wants to hide. The king's face is a battlefield of suppurating sores. His breath carries the stench of rotting teeth and internal decay. When he removes his glove to accept a document, you see fingers blackened with gangrene. The most magnificent ruler in the world, the man who claims divine right to rule over millions, is literally rotting alive. And everyone in this glittering palace knows it, yet no one dares speak the truth. The courtiers avert their eyes, the physicians craft elaborate lies, and the artists paint portraits that transform disease into divine radiance. This is the reality behind the golden facade of European royalty. A world where the most shameful diseases were hidden behind layers of cosmetics, propaganda, and outright deception. Where kings and queens who claimed to rule by God's will carried afflictions so horrifying that acknowledging them would shatter the very foundations of their power. Before diving into these forgotten stories of concealed suffering and royal deception, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark secrets together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the lies that shaped empires. What you're about to discover isn't just medical history. It's a masterclass in how power operates when it's built on illusion rather than reality. These weren't isolated cases of unfortunate monarchs dealing with common ailments. This was systematic deception on a scale that would make modern propaganda look primitive. Royal courts developed elaborate machinery of concealment that could transform the most grotesque diseases into symbols of divine favor, the most debilitating conditions into signs of noble breeding. The stakes couldn't have been higher. In an age where kings claimed to rule by divine appointment, physical perfection wasn't just desirable, it was essential to political survival. A diseased monarch wasn't just a sick person. They were living proof that God had withdrawn his blessing from the realm. Rival claimants to the throne would pounce on any sign of royal weakness. Foreign enemies would interpret disease as an opportunity for invasion, and the common people might lose faith in the entire system that kept them subjugated. So, royal courts became theaters of deception, where armies of physicians, artists, and courtiers collaborated to maintain elaborate lies about their rulers' health. The techniques they developed were so sophisticated, so thorough, that many of these deceptions lasted for centuries. Some were only uncovered when modern historians gained access to private medical records, secret correspondence, and physical evidence that had been hidden in royal archives for hundreds of years. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. The diseases themselves often revealed the hypocrisy at the heart of royal power. Monarchs who claimed divine right while suffering from ailments that were direct consequences of their own excess and moral corruption. Kings who preached virtue while their bodies bore the unmistakable marks of vice. Queens who presented themselves as pure and holy while battling conditions that exposed the reality of their private lives. The French court of the 17th and 18th centuries perfected this art of medical deception to a degree that would impress modern intelligence agencies. They understood that controlling information about the king's health wasn't just about protecting his dignity, it was about maintaining the entire political and social order that depended on the myth of royal perfection. Louis XIV's case was particularly masterful because his courtiers managed to transform his obvious physical decay into a symbol of his divine nature. When the king's body began failing in spectacular fashion, when his teeth rotted out of his skull, when gangrenous infections spread across his limbs, when internal parasites caused him to emit sounds and smells that would have disgusted a stable hand, the royal propaganda machine went into overdrive. Court physicians, many of them among the most learned men in Europe, collaborated in creating elaborate medical fictions. They diagnosed the king's rotting teeth as a sign that his royal essence was so pure it was incompatible with base matter like bone and enamel. They explained his gangrene as evidence that his divine spirit was burning too brightly for his mortal flesh to contain. They transformed his intestinal parasites into proof that even lower creatures recognized his majesty and sought to be close to him. These weren't just polite euphemisms. These were detailed medical theories, complete with scholarly citations and philosophical justifications that were disseminated throughout European courts as scientific fact. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their masters about the Sun King's miraculous ability to transcend normal human limitations through the very diseases that would have killed ordinary mortals. But the real genius of the system was how it involved everyone at court in maintaining the deception. Nobles competed for the privilege of attending the king's most intimate moments. His rising, his meals, his medical treatments, not despite his disgusting condition, but because witnessing his divine decay was presented as the highest honor imaginable. The lever ceremony, where hundreds of aristocrats would crowd into the royal bedchamber to watch Louis XIV get dressed, became a carefully choreographed performance designed to normalize the king's horrifying appearance. Courtiers learned to react with appropriate awe when they saw his blackened fingers, to express gratitude when they were splattered with pus from his open sores, to compete for the honor of holding his chamber pot when his diseased bowels betrayed him in public. This system of collective delusion was so effective that it became the template for royal courts across Europe. Every monarchy developed its own version of the machinery of medical concealment, each adapted to local conditions and cultural expectations, but all following the same basic principle: transform disease into divinity, weakness into strength, decay into transcendence. The artists played a crucial role in this deception. Royal portraitists became masters of medical fiction, learning to paint around missing limbs, to add hair where baldness revealed shameful conditions, to replace rotting skin with glowing complexion. They developed techniques so sophisticated that modern art historians still struggle to identify which features in royal portraits are accurate and which are elaborate lies. But these weren't just cosmetic touch-ups. The artists worked closely with physicians and courtiers to create visual narratives that explained away obvious physical problems. A king's trembling hands, clearly visible to anyone who met him in person, would be painted as gestures of divine inspiration. A queen's facial deformities, impossible to hide during public appearances, would be transformed into evidence of aristocratic breeding that elevated her above common standards of beauty. The level of coordination required was extraordinary. Painters, sculptors, poets, musicians, architects, physicians, diplomats, and hundreds of courtiers all had to maintain the same fictional version of royal health. Any crack in the facade, any moment where the reality slipped through could bring down not just individual monarchs but entire political systems. And the consequences of failure were severe. Physicians who let slip hints about the true nature of royal ailments could find themselves imprisoned or worse. Artists who painted too truthfully might see their careers destroyed. Courtiers who gossiped about what they witnessed in private could be exiled from court, which in that world was equivalent to social death. Yet despite all these precautions, the truth had a way of leaking out. Rival courts employed networks of spies specifically tasked with gathering intelligence about foreign rulers' health. Diplomats learned to read between the lines of official medical bulletins. Merchants and travelers brought back eyewitness accounts that contradicted official versions of royal well-being. Most dangerously, the diseases themselves often created evidence that was impossible to suppress entirely. When a king's condition caused him to behave erratically during public ceremonies, when a queen's illness made her unable to fulfill basic royal duties, When royal children were born with obvious signs of inherited ailments, the machinery of concealment faced its greatest tests. The Spanish Habsburgs faced this challenge in its most extreme form. By the late 17th century, their centuries of strategic inbreeding had produced monarchs whose physical and mental conditions were so severe that no amount of artistic license could completely hide the reality. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburg line, presented courtiers with an almost impossible task. How do you maintain the fiction of divine monarchy when your king is clearly incapable of basic human functions? The solutions they developed were masterpieces of creative deception that pushed the boundaries of what seemed possible. But they also revealed the fundamental weakness of any political system built on lies about human nature. Because ultimately, reality has a way of asserting itself, no matter how elaborate the mechanisms designed to suppress it. The techniques perfected in these royal courts didn't disappear with the age of absolute monarchy. They evolved, adapted to new technologies and political systems, but the basic principles remained the same. The machinery of concealment that transformed royal diseases into divine attributes became the foundation for modern propaganda techniques, public relations strategies, and political image management. Understanding how these historical deceptions worked isn't just about satisfying curiosity about the past. It's about recognizing the patterns that continue to shape how power operates in our own time. The ways that authority figures still use carefully crafted illusions to maintain positions that might not survive contact with unvarnished truth. What we're about to explore together is more than just a catalog of royal ailments and the lies told to conceal them. It's an investigation into the relationship between power and truth, between public image and private reality, between the stories we tell about our leaders and the human beings who actually hold positions of authority. The diseases these monarchs suffered from weren't just medical conditions. They were windows into the contradictions at the heart of their entire political system. Revelations of the gap between the myths that justified their rule and the reality of their human limitations. Let's begin with perhaps the most shocking example of royal medical deception in European history. The case of King Charles II of Spain, whose condition was so horrifying that his courtiers had to invent entirely new categories of divine blessing to explain what they were witnessing. Picture yourself as a foreign ambassador arriving at the Spanish court in 1690. You've traveled for weeks across treacherous mountain passes and bandit-infested roads, all to meet the most powerful monarch in the Western world. The Spanish Empire still stretches across 4 continents. Its treasure fleet still carries silver from the Americas, and its armies still hold sway over vast territories in Europe. You expect to encounter a figure of imperial majesty, a king whose very presence would justify Spain's claims to global dominance. Instead, you find yourself face to face with something that defies every assumption about royal dignity. Charles II shambles into the throne room with the unsteady gait of a man whose legs can barely support his own weight. His massive jaw hangs open, unable to close properly, causing saliva to stream continuously down his chin. His tongue, swollen and blackened, protrudes from his mouth like some grotesque ornament. When he attempts to speak, the sounds that emerge are barely recognizable as human language. A slurred mixture of Spanish and what can only be described as animal noises. But here's where the true genius of royal deception reveals itself. The Spanish courtiers don't treat this horrifying spectacle as evidence of disease or disability. Instead, they've constructed an elaborate theological explanation that transforms Charles's obvious incapacity into proof of his divine nature. His inability to speak clearly isn't seen as a speech impediment. It's presented as evidence that he communes directly with God in a celestial language, too pure for mortal understanding. His constant drooling isn't viewed as a symptom of neurological damage. It's described as the overflow of divine wisdom that his mortal body cannot contain. His trembling hands aren't recognized as signs of muscular degeneration. They're interpreted as the physical manifestation of his soul's eagerness to embrace heavenly glory. The court physicians, some of the most educated men in Europe, have developed detailed medical theories to support these interpretations. They've written treatises explaining how royal blood becomes so refined through generations of careful breeding that it eventually transcends the limitations of ordinary human flesh. They've created diagrams showing how divine essence flows through the king's body, causing the physical symptoms that lesser minds might mistake for illness. They've established protocols for interpreting every sound, every gesture, every bodily function as communications from the realm of the sacred. The artists face an even greater challenge. How do you paint a portrait of a king whose jaw deformity makes him look like a caricature of human development gone wrong? The court painters develop techniques that border on the supernatural. They learn to position Charles in ways that minimize the visibility of his protruding jaw. They master the art of painting implied rather than actual facial features, creating portraits where suggestion replaces accuracy. But the most remarkable achievement is how they transform his obvious intellectual limitations into signs of mystical wisdom. Charles II is almost certainly suffering from severe developmental disabilities caused by generations of Habsburg inbreeding. He struggles with basic cognitive tasks, shows little understanding of political realities, and often seems unaware of his surroundings. In any normal context, these would be recognized as symptoms of profound mental impairment. The Spanish court, however, presents these limitations as evidence of the king's spiritual advancement. His difficulty with worldly concerns is explained as proof that his mind is focused on higher divine matters. His apparent confusion during state ceremonies is interpreted as evidence that he's receiving direct revelations from God. His inability to grasp complex political situations is portrayed as the natural result of a soul too pure to be contaminated by earthly scheming. This isn't just spin or public relations. This is systematic reality distortion on a scale that would impress modern totalitarian regimes. Every person who comes into contact with the king must participate in maintaining this elaborate fiction. Foreign ambassadors are briefed on the proper way to interpret the king's behavior before they're granted audiences. Domestic nobles compete for positions that allow them to witness the king's divine communications firsthand. The machinery of deception becomes so comprehensive that it begins to shape reality itself. Courtiers who spend years interpreting the king's random sounds as profound wisdom start to believe their own interpretations. Physicians who have built their careers on explaining his symptoms as divine manifestations become emotionally invested in maintaining these explanations. Artists who have perfected techniques for painting around his deformities begin to see beauty in what others would recognize as tragic disfigurement. But Charles II's case represents just the most extreme example of a phenomenon that affected royal courts throughout Europe. The fundamental problem was that the entire system of absolute monarchy depended on the myth of royal perfection, yet the reality of human biology made such perfection impossible to maintain. Consider the case of Queen Anne of England, whose medical history reads like a catalog of everything that could go wrong with the human reproductive system. Anne endured 17 pregnancies, suffered at least 12 miscarriages, and watched all but one of her children die in infancy or early childhood. Her surviving son, Prince William, lived to age 11 before succumbing to what was probably pneumonia, leaving Anne without an heir and the Protestant succession in crisis. The medical reality of Anne's condition was straightforward enough. She almost certainly suffered from systemic lupus erythematosus, an autoimmune condition that would explain both her reproductive failures and the joint pain that left her increasingly immobilized as she aged. Her frequent pregnancies in the face of obvious fertility problems suggest that her physicians had little understanding of the underlying causes of her condition. But the political implications of acknowledging this medical reality were unthinkable. Anne's entire claim to legitimacy rested on her role as the Protestant alternative to her Catholic half-brother, James Edward Stuart. If the English people began to see her reproductive failures as evidence of divine displeasure, if they started to interpret her physical suffering as punishment for usurping the rightful Catholic succession, the entire political settlement that had brought her to the throne could collapse. So the English court developed its own version of medical mythology. Anne's miscarriages weren't presented as reproductive failures. They were described as evidence of her maternal devotion so intense that God called her unborn children home, rather than separate them from such a loving mother. Her physical pain wasn't seen as the symptom of autoimmune disease. It was interpreted as the natural result of carrying the spiritual burden of ruling a Christian nation. The court physicians crafted elaborate explanations for her condition that managed to transform obvious medical failure into evidence of royal virtue. They developed theories about how the Queen's pure Protestant faith made her body too holy to retain life that might be contaminated by the religious conflicts surrounding her reign. They created treatment protocols that were designed not to cure her condition, but to frame her suffering in ways that reinforced rather than undermined her political position. The artists faced their own challenges in depicting a queen whose body bore the obvious marks of repeated reproductive trauma. Anne aged rapidly under the strain of constant pregnancy and loss, her face becoming puffy and prematurely aged, her body swelling with the fluid retention that accompanied her autoimmune condition. Court painters learned to work around these realities, creating portraits that suggested maternal dignity while avoiding direct representation of her actual appearance. But perhaps the most sophisticated deception involved the presentation of her relationship with her children. The court developed elaborate ceremonies around each pregnancy, each birth, each tragic loss, that transformed what should have been private medical matters into public demonstrations of royal devotion. Anne's grief over her lost children became a cornerstone of her public image, proof of her maternal instincts and emotional depth. The irony was profound. A queen whose body was clearly unsuited for childbearing became celebrated throughout Europe as the embodiment of maternal virtue. Her reproductive failures, which should have been seen as evidence against divine favor, were transformed into proof of her spiritual superiority. The very condition that threatened her dynasty's survival became the foundation of her popular appeal. These patterns of deception weren't limited to physical ailments. Mental health conditions presented even greater challenges for royal courts because psychological disorders struck at the very heart of claims about divine appointment and superior breeding. A king who suffered from obvious mental illness called into question not just his individual fitness to rule, but the entire theoretical framework that justified monarchy itself. The case of King George III of England illustrates how courts dealt with royal mental illness through elaborate systems of concealment and reinterpretation. George's condition, now believed to have been acute intermittent porphyria, caused episodes of severe psychological disturbance that made normal royal functions impossible. During his worst attacks, he would rave incoherently, become physically violent, and lose all recognition of his family and courtiers. The English establishment faced a crisis that threatened the stability of the entire constitutional system. If the king was mad, who had the authority to rule in his place? How could a nation that claimed divine sanction for its monarchy explain why God had allowed their ruler's mind to collapse? What did it mean for the Protestant succession if the defender of the faith was clearly incapable of rational thought? The solutions they developed were masterpieces of political creativity. Rather than acknowledge that the king was suffering from mental illness, court physicians developed elaborate theories about his condition that transformed psychological breakdown into evidence of spiritual sensitivity. They explained his violent outbursts as righteous anger at the sins of his subjects. They interpreted his incoherent rambling as prophetic utterances too profound for ordinary understanding. The English court physicians went further, creating detailed medical journals that documented the king's divine communications with the same scholarly precision they might use to record the symptoms of smallpox or consumption. They established protocols for interpreting his most disturbed utterances as royal proclamations, developing a kind of theological linguistics that could find profound meaning in the ravings of a mind consumed by biochemical chaos. But the real genius lay in how they transformed the king's lucid intervals into proof of the divine nature of his condition. When George III emerged from his episodes of madness, appearing rational and capable of normal conversation, this wasn't presented as evidence that his previous behavior had been pathological. Instead, these moments of clarity were described as temporary returns from his spiritual journeys, brief visits to the earthly realm before his soul resumed its communion with higher powers. The court artists faced an almost impossible task. How do you paint a portrait of a king during periods when his eyes burn with the wild intensity of acute psychosis? How do you capture royal dignity in a face contorted by the neurological effects of a metabolic disorder? The painters developed techniques that bordered on the mystical, learning to see past the surface manifestations of disease to create images that suggested the king's true spiritual state. They painted George III not as he appeared during his episodes, wild-haired, restraint-marked, bearing the physical signs of a man whose body was consuming itself from within, but, as they claimed, his soul appeared to divine sight. Their portraits showed a monarch whose eyes held depths of wisdom rather than depths of madness, whose bearing suggested communion with angels rather than the tragic isolation of mental illness. The most remarkable aspect of this deception was how it required the participation of everyone who came into contact with the king. Foreign ambassadors had to be coached on how to interpret the king's bizarre behavior during state functions. Domestic courtiers competed for the privilege of witnessing what they were told were mystical experiences rather than psychotic episodes. Even the king's own family learned to see his condition through the lens of royal mythology rather than medical reality. Queen Charlotte, George's wife, became a master of this interpretive art. She spent decades translating her husband's incoherent ravings into royal wisdom, his violent outbursts into evidence of passionate devotion to his subjects, his complete breaks from reality into spiritual transcendence. Her private letters reveal a woman torn between genuine love for her husband and the exhausting demands of maintaining public fiction about his condition. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of George III's case was how the machinery of concealment actually made his condition worse. Instead of receiving treatment that might have helped manage his symptoms, the king was subjected to therapeutic interventions designed primarily to maintain the royal fiction. Court physicians restrained him not to prevent self-injury, but to create the appearance of divine ecstasy. They administered treatments not to address his underlying metabolic disorder, but to produce behaviors that could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural communion. The king became a prisoner of his own mythology, trapped in a system that valued the maintenance of royal dignity above his actual well-being. His genuine suffering was transformed into theater, his medical needs subordinated to political necessities, his human realities sacrificed to preserve the illusion of divine monarchy. This pattern of sacrificing royal humanity to maintain political mythology reached its most extreme expression in the court of Russian czars. The Romanov dynasty faced unique challenges in concealing royal diseases, because their claims to absolute power rested not just on divine appointment, but on their supposed embodiment of Russian Orthodox spirituality. Any sign of physical or mental weakness could be interpreted as evidence that God had withdrawn his blessing from the dynasty. Tsar Ivan the Terrible presents one of history's most chilling examples of how royal courts could transform obvious mental illness into evidence of divine favor. Ivan's condition, which modern psychiatrists would likely diagnose as severe bipolar disorder, complicated by possible organic brain damage, manifested in episodes of extreme violence followed by periods of deep religious obsession. During his manic phases, Ivan would order mass executions based on paranoid delusions, personally torture suspected enemies with medieval brutality, and engage in sexual violence that scandalized even the brutal standards of 16th century Russian court life. During his depressive episodes, he would retreat to monasteries, spend days prostrating himself before icons, and compose lengthy theological treatises filled with apocalyptic imagery. The Russian Orthodox clergy, working closely with court officials, developed theological explanations for Ivan's behavior that transformed obvious pathology into evidence of spiritual greatness. They explained his violent episodes as righteous anger at the corruption that surrounded him, divine wrath channeled through his royal person to purify the Russian state. They interpreted his periods of religious obsession as evidence of his direct communication with God, his theological writings as divinely inspired scripture. But the most sophisticated aspect of this deception involved the creation of what might be called a theology of royal suffering. The Orthodox clergy developed elaborate doctrines explaining how truly holy rulers must endure spiritual torments that would destroy ordinary souls. They taught that Ivan's obvious mental anguish was proof of his superior spiritual development, that his psychological pain demonstrated his willingness to bear the sins of his people. This theological framework allowed the court to present the Tsar's most disturbed behavior as evidence of his fitness to rule, rather than proof of his incapacity. When Ivan killed his own son in a fit of rage, striking him with an iron rod during what was clearly a psychotic episode, the court historians recorded this not as an act of madness, but as a tragic demonstration of the Tsar's willingness to sacrifice even his beloved heir to God's will. The artistic representations of Ivan the Terrible show how thoroughly this mythology penetrated Russian culture. Icon painters depicted him not as the obviously disturbed individual described in private court documents, but as a figure of terrible divine majesty, his eyes burning with holy fire rather than psychotic intensity. These images became so embedded in Russian consciousness that they shaped how the Tsar was remembered for centuries. Yet private documents from Ivan's court reveal the human cost of maintaining this elaborate deception. His physicians, many of them foreign-trained and capable of recognizing mental illness, were forced to participate in treatments designed to enhance rather than cure his condition. They administered substances that would intensify his visions rather than calm his mind, encouraged practices that fed his paranoia rather than addressing his underlying psychological needs. The courtiers who surrounded Ivan lived in constant terror, never knowing whether they would encounter the depressed mystic or the homicidal maniac. Many developed what modern psychology would recognize as severe trauma responses, becoming hypervigilant, paranoid, and emotionally numbed by their exposure to unpredictable royal violence. Yet they had to maintain the fiction that serving such a ruler was the highest honor imaginable. The pattern established in Ivan's court influenced Russian royal culture for centuries. Subsequent czars who showed signs of mental instability found themselves trapped in similar systems of theological interpretation that prevented effective treatment while demanding increasingly elaborate performances of divine madness. Peter the Great, despite his genuine administrative and military abilities, suffered from what appears to have been severe epilepsy, complicated by alcohol abuse and possible traumatic brain injury. His seizures, which could leave him unconscious and convulsing for hours, were presented by court propagandists as evidence of his direct communication with divine forces. His violent rages, probably related to his neurological condition, were interpreted as manifestations of holy anger at Russian backwardness. The most disturbing aspect of Peter's case was how his court learned to choreograph his seizures for maximum political impact, rather than seeking medical treatment that might have reduced the frequency or severity of his episodes. Court officials developed elaborate ceremonies around these events. They would time important announcements to coincide with his seizures, presenting his unconscious convulsions as visible proof that God was speaking through him. Foreign observers who witnessed these spectacles were often horrified by what they saw, but Russian courtiers had been trained to interpret the Tsar's obvious medical distress as evidence of supernatural power. They would kneel around his convulsing body, claiming to hear divine messages in his incoherent utterances, competing for the honor of being splattered with the foam that emerged from his mouth during the worst episodes. The psychological damage inflicted on everyone involved in maintaining these deceptions was immense. Court physicians found themselves complicit in medical practices that violated everything they had learned about healing. Artists were forced to create images that contradicted the evidence of their own eyes. Courtiers had to participate in rituals that celebrated human suffering as divine blessing. Perhaps most tragically, the royal victims of these elaborate deceptions often came to believe the mythologies created around their conditions. They learned to see their own suffering through the lens of royal propaganda, interpreting their pain as evidence of their spiritual superiority rather than seeking relief through available treatments. This internalization of royal mythology created a vicious cycle where diseased monarchs actively resisted medical intervention that might have helped them, fearing that recovery would undermine their claims to divine favor. They became addicted to their own suffering, convinced that their pain was the price and proof of their exalted status. The machinery of royal medical deception reached its most sophisticated form in the courts of 18th century Europe, where Enlightenment rationality paradoxically enabled more elaborate and scientifically sophisticated forms of lie-telling about royal health. Courts began employing teams of physicians, natural philosophers, and what we might now call public relations specialists to create comprehensive medical mythologies. These weren't crude superstitions or simple propaganda campaigns. They were elaborate intellectual constructions that drew on the latest scientific theories, philosophical systems, and artistic techniques to transform disease into divinity. The courts of this period produced medical documents, artistic works, and philosophical treatises about royal health that represented the pinnacle of creative deception. But as we'll discover, this very sophistication contained the seeds of the system's eventual destruction. The more elaborate the deceptions became, the more vulnerable they were to exposure by the new spirit of empirical inquiry that characterized the Enlightenment. The age that perfected royal medical mythology also created the intellectual tools that would eventually tear those mythologies apart. The transformation of royal medical deception during the Enlightenment created a fascinating paradox. Just as courts were developing their most sophisticated techniques for hiding disease, they were also inadvertently creating the conditions for their own exposure. The very rationality that enabled more elaborate mythologies about royal health also produced skeptical minds capable of seeing through those deceptions. Consider the court of Frederick the Great of Prussia, where Enlightenment philosophy and traditional royal mythology collided in spectacular fashion. Frederick, who corresponded with Voltaire and fashioned himself as a philosopher king, suffered from what modern medicine would recognize as severe chronic kidney disease, complicated by what was probably bipolar disorder. His condition caused him excruciating pain, unpredictable mood swings, and periods of complete physical incapacitation. The Prussian court faced a unique challenge. How do you maintain the fiction of royal perfection around a king who publicly embraces rational inquiry and scientific method? Frederick's own writings celebrated the power of reason to cut through superstition and reveal truth. Yet his courtiers needed to conceal truths about his condition that would have undermined everything he claimed to represent. The solution they developed was brilliantly perverse. Instead of creating supernatural explanations for Frederick's ailments, they transformed his diseases into evidence of his philosophical superiority. His kidney pain wasn't presented as a medical condition. It was described as the physical manifestation of his mind's intense engagement with abstract philosophical problems. His mood swings weren't seen as symptoms of mental illness. They were interpreted as the natural result of a superior intellect grappling with concepts too profound for ordinary minds to grasp. Court physicians, many of them genuine scholars influenced by the latest medical theories, collaborated in creating what might be called scientific mythology. They wrote detailed treatises explaining how Frederick's condition represented an evolution beyond normal human limitations. They developed elaborate theories about how philosophical contemplation could transform the body's relationship to pain, how intellectual greatness could manifest as physical symptoms that appeared pathological to lesser minds. The artists working for Frederick's court faced their own version of this challenge. How do you paint a portrait of an Enlightenment monarch whose face is twisted with chronic pain, whose body is bent by disease, whose eyes sometimes burn with the intensity of mania or glaze with the emptiness of severe depression? The painters developed techniques that managed to suggest both physical suffering and intellectual transcendence simultaneously. They learned to paint Frederick's pain-contorted features as expressions of deep philosophical contemplation. They transformed his disease-ravaged body into a vessel too refined for crude physical existence. They created images that suggested his obvious medical distress was actually evidence of his mind's superiority to material concerns. These weren't simple lies. They were sophisticated visual arguments about the relationship between intellectual greatness and physical suffering. But Frederick's case reveals something darker about Enlightenment attitudes toward royal disease. The same rational spirit that questioned traditional superstitions created new, more sophisticated forms of deception. Court intellectuals didn't abandon the practice of transforming royal ailments into evidence of superiority. They simply developed more convincing theoretical frameworks for doing so. The French court under Louis XV took this approach even further, creating what might be called medicalized absolutism. Louis XV suffered from what appears to have been severe depression, complicated by what modern physicians would recognize as chronic fatigue syndrome and possibly an autoimmune disorder. His condition left him frequently unable to perform basic royal functions, prone to episodes of complete withdrawal from public life, and dependent on increasingly elaborate medications that often made his symptoms worse. The court physicians, influenced by the latest developments in anatomy and physiology, developed explanations for the king's condition that drew on cutting-edge medical theory while serving traditional political needs. They explained his chronic fatigue as evidence that his royal essence burned so intensely it exhausted ordinary physical systems. They interpreted his depression as proof that his soul was too sensitive for the corrupted world he was called to rule. Most remarkably, they transformed his obvious medication dependence into evidence of his scientific sophistication. Louis XV consumed enormous quantities of what were essentially primitive antidepressants and stimulants, compounds containing mercury, opium, and various plant extracts that provided temporary relief while causing long-term damage. Rather than acknowledging this as drug dependency, court physicians presented it as evidence of the king's enlightened approach to managing his superior constitution. They created detailed pharmaceutical theories explaining how royal blood required special chemical interventions unknown to common medicine. They established elaborate protocols for preparing and administering the king's medications that resembled religious rituals more than medical procedures. They transformed what was obviously addiction into evidence of scientific advancement. The court of Catherine the Great of Russia pushed these techniques to their logical extreme. Catherine suffered from what modern medicine would recognize as severe diabetes, complicated by cardiovascular disease and probable early-stage dementia. Her condition caused her to experience dramatic mood swings, periods of confusion, and episodes where she would lose consciousness without warning. The Russian court, influenced by French models but adapted to Orthodox sensibilities, developed perhaps the most sophisticated system of medical deception in European history. They created a comprehensive mythology that explained Catherine's condition as evidence of her unique position as both an earthly ruler and a conduit for divine wisdom. When Catherine experienced diabetic episodes that left her disoriented and confused, court officials presented these as periods of mystical communion, where she received direct guidance from God about governance. When her cardiovascular problems caused her to collapse during state ceremonies, these incidents were described as moments when her soul temporarily abandoned her body to survey the empire from a divine perspective. The court physicians, many of them trained in the latest European medical schools, collaborated in creating detailed medical journals that documented Catherine's condition using scientific terminology while maintaining elaborate fictions about its true nature. They developed theories about how imperial responsibility could transform normal physiological processes, how the burden of ruling vast territories could cause unique medical conditions unknown to ordinary medicine. But Catherine's case also reveals how these deceptions could become self-perpetuating in ways that harmed the very monarchs they were designed to protect. The Empress began to believe the mythologies created around her condition, interpreting her obvious medical symptoms as evidence of her divine appointment, rather than signs that she needed treatment. She actively resisted medical interventions that might have helped manage her diabetes, fearing that controlling her symptoms would interfere with what she had been taught to see as divine communications. She insisted on maintaining activities and dietary habits that worsened her condition, because court mythology had convinced her that her suffering was the price of her spiritual superiority. The tragic irony was profound. The very system designed to protect royal dignity by concealing disease often made those diseases worse by preventing effective treatment. Monarchs who might have lived longer, healthier lives with proper medical care instead became prisoners of their own mythologies, trapped in cycles of suffering that they had been taught to interpret as evidence of their fitness to rule. The artistic representations from Catherine's court show how thoroughly these deceptions penetrated Russian culture. Portrait painters depicted her not as the obviously ill woman described in private medical documents, but as a figure of divine majesty whose physical form barely contained her spiritual essence. These images became so embedded in Russian consciousness that they shaped how Catherine was remembered long after her death. Yet private letters from court physicians reveal the human cost of maintaining these elaborate fictions. Doctors who had sworn oaths to heal found themselves complicit in treatments designed to preserve political mythology rather than address medical needs. They administered therapies that were more theater than medicine, participating in ceremonies that celebrated suffering rather than seeking to alleviate it. The psychological toll on everyone involved in these deceptions was immense. Courtiers developed elaborate psychological defenses to cope with the cognitive dissonance of simultaneously witnessing obvious disease while publicly celebrating divine health. Many showed signs of what modern psychology would recognize as dissociative disorders, learning to compartmentalize their perceptions so completely that they could genuinely believe contradictory realities. Foreign observers who encountered these courts often struggled to understand what they were witnessing. Diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals genuine confusion about whether European monarchs were actually suffering from the conditions that seemed obvious to outside eyes, or whether there were aspects of royal physiology that foreigners simply couldn't comprehend. Some ambassadors began to suspect that they were witnessing elaborate performances designed to test their diplomatic skills. Others wondered if the diseases they observed were somehow different when they affected royal blood. A few perceptive observers recognized the systematic nature of the deceptions they were witnessing, but diplomatic protocol prevented them from acknowledging this understanding publicly. The most sophisticated courts developed techniques for managing these foreign perceptions, creating different versions of royal health mythology for different audiences. Domestic subjects received elaborate theological or philosophical explanations for royal ailments. Foreign diplomats encountered carefully crafted medical presentations that suggested mysterious but not shameful conditions. Enemy governments were fed disinformation designed to either exaggerate or minimize royal health problems depending on strategic considerations. But by the late 18th century, the very success of these deception systems began to create new vulnerabilities. The elaborate infrastructures required to maintain royal health mythologies became so complex that they required hundreds of participants, each of whom represented a potential security breach. The sophisticated intellectual frameworks used to explain royal diseases became vulnerable to analysis by increasingly educated populations who were learning to apply rational inquiry to political claims. The French Revolution represented the catastrophic collapse of the most sophisticated royal deception system in European history. When revolutionary forces gained access to the medical records, private correspondence, and court documents that had been used to maintain elaborate fictions about royal health, the revelations were devastating to any remaining belief in the divine nature of monarchy. The revolutionaries didn't just execute Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette for their political crimes. They systematically exposed the medical realities that had been hidden behind decades of royal mythology. They published detailed accounts of the royal family's actual health conditions, revealing the gap between public presentations and private realities that had characterized the entire system of absolute monarchy. These revelations had profound psychological effects on European populations who had been raised to believe in the divine nature of royal authority. The discovery that their supposedly perfect rulers had been suffering from the same diseases that afflicted common people, that the elaborate ceremonies they had witnessed were designed to conceal rather than reveal truth, shattered fundamental assumptions about the nature of political authority. The exposure of royal medical deceptions became a crucial component of the broader intellectual revolution that was transforming European society. People who learned that their kings and queens had been lying about their health began to question other royal claims about divine appointment, superior breeding, and natural fitness to rule. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation was how thoroughly the systems of medical deception had corrupted the practice of medicine itself. Revolutionary investigators discovered that court physicians had systematically violated their medical ethics, prioritizing political mythology over patient care, administering treatments designed to preserve royal dignity rather than promote healing. The medical profession, which had claimed to serve the cause of human health and well-being, was revealed to have been complicit in elaborate systems of deception that often made their royal patients sicker rather than better. This discovery contributed to a broader crisis of confidence in established authority that extended far beyond questions of political legitimacy. The collapse of royal medical mythology in France sent shockwaves throughout European court society. Monarchs who had relied on similar systems of deception suddenly found themselves vulnerable to the same kind of exposure that had contributed to the French royal family's destruction. Courts across Europe began scrambling to reform their medical presentation systems, but the fundamental contradiction remained unresolved. The age of democratic revolution had created new expectations for political transparency that were incompatible with the elaborate deceptions that had sustained royal authority for centuries. Populations that had learned to demand rational justifications for political power were no longer willing to accept mysterious ailments as evidence of divine favor. Yet the techniques perfected in these royal courts didn't disappear with the end of absolute monarchy. They evolved and adapted to new political systems, new technologies, and new forms of authority. The basic principles of transforming weakness into strength, disease into distinction, private suffering into public virtue, continued to shape how political power presented itself to the world. The machinery of concealment that had been developed to hide royal diseases became the foundation for modern political image management, public relations strategies, and propaganda techniques. The same psychological principles that had enabled courtiers to see divine favor in obvious pathology continue to operate in democratic societies, where voters learn to interpret their leaders' flaws as evidence of their humanity and relatability. Understanding how these historical deceptions worked provides crucial insights into how power continues to operate in our own time. The patterns established in royal courts, the collaboration between authority figures and supposedly independent experts, the transformation of obvious problems into evidence of superiority, the creation of elaborate mythologies to explain away uncomfortable realities, remain fundamental to how political authority maintains itself in the face of human limitations. The royal courts that perfected these techniques of medical deception created more than just historical curiosities. They established templates for the relationship between power and truth that continue to shape our world. The question isn't whether such deceptions still exist. It's whether we've developed the intellectual tools necessary to recognize them when they're operating in contemporary forms. As we prepare to explore the most shocking examples of royal medical concealment, remember that these aren't just stories about the distant past. They're case studies in how human psychology, political necessity, and the desire to believe in superior authority can combine to create collective delusions that persist for centuries. The diseases hidden behind royal facades weren't just medical conditions. They were windows into the fundamental contradictions of any political system built on claims of human superiority. And those contradictions, as we'll discover, had consequences that extended far beyond the palace walls where they were first concealed. The most chilling aspect of these royal medical deceptions wasn't their sophistication. It was how completely they succeeded in rewriting reality itself. By the time revolutionary forces began exposing these elaborate lies, entire populations had spent generations believing that their rulers' obvious diseases were actually signs of divine blessing. The psychological damage went far deeper than simple political disillusionment. Consider what happened when the people of Europe finally learned the truth. Peasants who had spent their lives scraping together coins to pay taxes that funded their king's medical mythology discovered that their supposedly divine ruler had been rotting from syphilis while claiming celibate purity. Soldiers who had died in wars justified by their monarch's divine mandate learned posthumously that their leader had been hallucinating from mercury poisoning. During the campaigns that cost them their lives, the revelation that royal perfection had been an elaborate theatrical production didn't just destroy faith in individual monarchs, it shattered fundamental assumptions about the nature of authority itself. If kings and queens could lie so comprehensively about something as basic as their physical health, what other foundational truths were actually carefully constructed fictions? This crisis of confidence created a psychological vacuum that political movements across the spectrum rushed to fill. Some embraced radical democracy, arguing that the exposure of royal deceptions proved that no individual could be trusted with concentrated power. Others turned toward new forms of authoritarianism, claiming that the chaos unleashed by questioning traditional authority required even more elaborate systems of control. But perhaps most disturbing was how quickly new forms of the same deceptive patterns emerged. The techniques perfected in royal courts didn't disappear. They migrated to new institutions and adapted to new technologies. Democratic politicians learned to present their obvious character flaws as evidence of their relatability to common people. Military leaders transformed their strategic failures into proof of their willingness to take necessary risks. Business moguls converted their ethical violations into demonstrations of their competitive superiority. The fundamental psychology that had enabled courtiers to see divine favor in royal disease proved remarkably adaptable to different political systems. Voters in democratic societies showed the same willingness to rationalize their leaders' obvious problems that courtiers had displayed when confronted with their monarch's grotesque ailments. The machinery of collective self-deception, once unleashed, proved nearly impossible to contain. Modern political image management draws directly from the playbook developed in these royal courts. The same techniques used to transform Charles II's drooling into evidence of divine communication now help transform contemporary leaders' gaffes into proof of their authenticity. The artistic methods that painted around George III's madness now inspire photo editing and media presentation strategies that create carefully curated versions of political reality. The medical professionals who once collaborated in royal deceptions have their modern counterparts in the armies of experts who provide scientific-sounding explanations for contemporary authority figures' obvious limitations. The courtiers who competed for the privilege of witnessing royal suffering have evolved into media personalities who celebrate their access to power while carefully avoiding acknowledgement of what they actually observe. What makes this historical pattern even more relevant today is how technology has amplified both the possibilities for deception and the potential consequences of exposure. Royal courts could control information flow within relatively small circles of courtiers and subjects. Modern authority figures must manage their image across global communication networks, where any crack in their carefully constructed facades can be instantly transmitted to millions of observers. Yet the basic human psychology remains unchanged. People still want to believe that their leaders possess qualities that justify their authority. They still participate in collective fictions that make uncomfortable realities more palatable. They still collaborate in systems of interpretation that transform obvious problems into evidence of hidden strengths. The legacy of royal medical deception lives on not just in political techniques, but in the fundamental questions it raises about the relationship between power and truth. These historical examples force us to confront uncomfortable realities about our own willingness to believe convenient lies, our participation in systems that prioritize image over substance, and our complicity in perpetuating deceptions that serve our psychological needs even when they contradict obvious evidence. The monarchs who suffered behind their elaborate facades were ultimately victims of systems they helped create but couldn't control. Their genuine human pain was sacrificed to maintain political mythologies that trapped them in cycles of deception and suffering. Their stories serve as warnings about the price of building authority on foundations of systematic dishonesty. But perhaps their most important legacy is the reminder that no system of power, no matter how sophisticated its techniques of concealment, can indefinitely suppress the human cost of its deceptions. Reality has a way of asserting itself eventually, often with consequences far more devastating than the honest acknowledgement of limitation would have been. The royal courts that perfected these techniques of medical mythology ultimately destroyed themselves through their own success. By creating expectations of perfection that no human being could meet, they guaranteed their eventual exposure and collapse. The very sophistication of their deceptions made the revelation of truth more shocking and politically devastating than simple honesty would have been. As we navigate our own era of carefully managed political images and expert validated mythologies, these historical examples offer crucial insights into the patterns that continue to shape how authority presents itself and how populations respond to that presentation. The diseases hidden behind royal facades weren't just medical curiosities, they were symbols of the eternal tension between human limitation and the political necessity of appearing superhuman. The question these stories ultimately pose isn't whether our contemporary leaders are hiding shameful secrets, it's whether we've learned to recognize the sophisticated machinery of concealment when it's operating in our own time, and whether we have the courage to demand the kind of honesty that these historical examples suggest is essential for sustainable authority. The golden facades that once concealed royal decay have evolved into new forms, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do we build political systems that can acknowledge human limitation without sacrificing effective governance? The answer may lie not in perfecting techniques of concealment, but in developing the collective maturity to accept leaders who are honestly human rather than dishonestly divine. The shameful diseases hidden behind royal splendor ultimately revealed truths about power that extend far beyond the palace walls where they were first concealed. They remind us that authority built on lies about human nature carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction, and that the most dangerous deceptions are often the ones we most desperately want to believe.